Hi, in this video, I want to talk a little bit about default gateways, how the host has a default gateway, a switch might need a default gateway, and I say might, and a router will have something similar to a default gateway. Let's take a look at what I mean by all this. So first of all, the host. So let's take a look at the IP configuration of PC1. So here it's being obtained IP address automatically, which is always a good thing for our clients. For our servers, we may want to do it statically. Talk about that later. So let's take a look at the IP address. There we go. Okay, so as we talked about in a previous video, the IP address and subnet mask actually tells the device what network it belongs to. In this case, 192.168.10.0/24. For any packets that PC1 needs to send within its network, it knows it can reach that device directly, like the 192.168.10.11 device. Anything in the 192.168.10.0 network, in this case, any destination IP address, IPv4 address, that begins with those three numbers, 192.168.10. Kind of hard to see those three. There we go. Okay. Any packet with a destination IP address that begins with those three numbers, I can get there directly without going through the router. For anything else, like if I'm sending a packet to the 192.168.11 network, in this case, PC3 at 192.168.11.0, PC1 knows, oh, we're not in, that device is not in the 192.168.10.0 network. It's in the 192.168.11.0 network. Actually, it doesn't know exactly what network it's in. It just knows it's not in my network. We'll talk about that more later. But in that case, it knows, hey, I have to send that packet to a default gateway. So if you want a device to communicate with other devices outside its network, it needs a default gateway address. Okay. Doesn't need the default gateway if you just want it to communicate with devices in your own network. That's why things like your printer at home, for example, doesn't need a default gateway address because it's only communicating with devices in its own network. But your laptops, your mobile phones, your desktop computers, they're all going to need default gateway addresses to be able to communicate with devices outside its network. All right, so that's the host. Let's take a look now at the switch. All right, this is actually can be kind of confusing to people because let's take a look at what a switch is, first of all. A switch is a layer 2 device. We're talking about Ethernet switches here. Its job is to forward Ethernet frames. It only looks at layer 2 Ethernet addresses. It doesn't care about IP. So why are we talking IP addresses and default gateways here? I'll get there in a moment. So switch is all about layer 2 forwarding based on the MAC addresses, right? We talked about MAC address tables in previous videos and how switches forward frames. And we never talk about IP. Matter of fact, Ethernet switches will send anything that doesn't have to be an IP packet inside. It could be anything inside. The other thing it typically will have is something called spanning tree protocol to prevent layer 2 loops. Talk about that in another video. Actually, I have a series of videos on spanning tree if you're interested. But it really has nothing to do with IP. So why are we talking about IP here? Well, let's take a look. Let me get rid of that. Okay, now in this case here, we have an IP address on this switch. Now, why do we have an IP address on this switch? The reason is for us to be able to remotely manage the switch. If you just go to some computer store and buy a $25 switch, chances are you're not going to be able to have an IP address on it so you can remotely manage it. This is typically for business level switches where you want to be able to manage that switch, because typically you're going to want to do things on that switch, or at least check things on that switch, even something as simple as checking the MAC address table or the spanning tree information. You may want to do that remotely without actually having to go to the switch and plug in, or even if you're able to look at the information on it. A lot of your cheap switches, you can't see anything except, the lights. But on your more manageable switches, like our Cisco switches, we can actually manage those. And if we want to manage those remotely, it's going to need an IP address. All right, can understand why we need an IP address, so we can SSH into it. Could Telnet, but Telnet is, we want to kind of get away from Telnet and use Secure Shell for remote login. Now, why does it have a default gateway? Well, the reason why is if we are remotely logging in, let's start with remotely logging into the switch and we're on the same network. If we're on the same network as the IP address of the switch, then we don't care about, the switch doesn't care about a default gateway because we're on the same network. Okay? But let's think of this just like a host. Okay? So in this case here, this switch here is just like another host that we're connecting to. Okay? It's acting as another IP device, in this case, a remote IP device. So just like, let's say this is Allegra, it's my cousin. So my cousin Allegra is having to connect to the switch. Her computer, of course, needs an IP address and also needs a default gateway address because the switch is on a remote network. So it's going to send those packets to the default gateway. Well, the packets coming back from the switch back to Allegra, those are going to be encapsulated in Ethernet frame that needs to be sent to the default gateway of its local router. Hence, the default gateway that the switch needs to know about. Okay, and again, both of these are just to be able to manage the switch remotely. Okay, and you find these mostly on your business level switches. Again, they really don't have anything to do with the switch's operation, its basic operation of performing layer 2 Ethernet forwarding. It's for manageability. All right, one last, and we'll be talking more about this next one in more detail, but the router. So routers, let's take a look here. A router has something called a routing table. We talked a little bit about that already, and we'll talk more about that in more detail later. But I just want to mention something else that the router will have in part of its routing table. A lot of times it will have something called a default route. And what is a default route? Well, let's say router R2 knows about all these networks, knows about this network, of course knows about this network, this network, this network, and any other remote networks out here. Okay, so it knows about all these networks, but there's hundreds of thousands of summarized, actually millions of networks in the internet. It doesn't need to know about all those hundreds of thousands of networks in the internet. What it just needs to know is, I know about these networks here in my routing table, but really, excuse me, for everything else in the internet, I'm just going to send them to this next hop router that's right here. I just need what's called a default route, just like your host has a default gateway on a network, sends it to the local router for anything not in its network. A router, for anything not in its routing table, will send it to a default route, meaning if I don't know about it specifically in my routing table, who's my default? Who do I send everything else to? And this is what your home router has, right? It has a default route pointing upstream to its provider. Okay. So in this video, we've seen, let me kind of clear this here, all right. So we've seen kind of the use of a default route for both a host to reach devices outside its network, a switch, and again, this is just for remote communications, and in this case, communicating remotely for manageability purposes with a device outside its network, and the router. And the router has some kind of default route, so it can keep its routing tables smaller and not have to know about hundreds of thousands of networks that it doesn't need to know about, especially if it only has one path to that network, its upstream provider. Okay, we'll be talking more about routing and switching in later videos, and the host too.